Just one verse. Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. That's all the Bible will ever tell you about her. Cain knew his wife. She conceived, and the text closes the door. No name, no origin, not a single line about who she was before this verse, nor where she came from. One sentence, and then the longest silence in all Scripture. What follows is not an opinion, it's an investigation into a woman whom 4 distinct traditions have tried to name, each separately, each unaware of what the others had found. You're about to see a verse you've heard read 1,000 times without ever being shown what it hides. You'll hear a 5th century bishop admit, in a text the church still preserves today, a truth no one preaches anymore. And you'll understand why this silence is not forgetfulness, it's a choice. If you're watching this, it's probably no accident. What this verse implies has been kept out of reach for good institutional reasons. Today, the case is opened. Let's start from the beginning. Genesis chapter 4. Cain has just killed Abel, his brother. God marks him with a sign so no one will strike him down. Cain leaves and settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden, a land of sand and wind that the text never describes except by its direction, as if the place itself doesn't deserve a geography. And it's there, at verse 17, that the sentence falls. Cain knew his wife, who conceived and bore Enoch. She's there, without transition, without introduction. A woman appears in the most read text in human history, and no one gives her a face. Because at this exact point in the story, remember this count, Genesis has named only 4 living human beings: Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, already dead, murdered in the previous verse. 4 people, 1 murder, and suddenly a 5th, a woman, appears without any birth, genealogy, or word ever announcing her existence. Where does she come from? This is not a modern question. This is not a 21st century feminist reading projected onto an ancient text. This question has been asked, word for word, by Jewish and Christian commentators since the very earliest centuries of rabbinic and patristic interpretation. A biblical editor, a man or a school of scribes, no one knows, left a gap in his own text, and that gap, for 2,000 years, no one has wanted to close out loud. Here is the first bridge, because this textual silence is not just a problem for scholars. Imagine for a moment what this absence of a name means for a real life. A woman walks alongside a marked man, a man whom his own God has just designated as untouchable and yet cursed. They leave the only world they know, their parents, the garden, the memory of the dead brother, for a land without law, without clan, without neighbors, without anyone to arbitrate a conflict or tend to a wound. No tribe to protect her if Cain falls ill. No mother to assist her when she gives birth. Alone, in a land that the text names only with a word meaning wandering. She moves forward with a man whose own blood she knows better than anyone what he has done to it. And yet she gives birth. That fear of being bound for life to the only living person left to you, without knowing if they protect you or drag you into their own sentence. That fear belongs to no era. It crosses centuries without needing a name to be recognized. And maybe that's why the text erases her. It's not just her identity that disturbs. It's what her presence in this 4-person world forces us to admit. Because the question, where does she come from, has, within the strict framework of the story, only a very limited number of possible answers. And one of them imposes itself with a force that Christian exegesis took centuries to voice aloud. One man said it, one alone, among the founding fathers of Western theology. A bishop from North Africa in the 5th century, in the most ambitious work ever written to defend the Christian faith in the face of Rome's collapse. Augustine of Hippo, the City of God, Book 15, Chapter 16. There, without detour, without disguise, the bishop writes black on white what generations of preachers would then choose never to read aloud from a pulpit. The first marriages of humanity were necessarily, his word, marriages between brothers and sisters. Not a hypothesis, not an allegorical reading, a logical necessity which Augustine assumes and justifies by the urgency to populate the earth at a time when, in his own words, the matter was not yet forbidden. Not a myth, not a legend, not a late interpretation imposed on the text. An admission, signed, dated, preserved in one of the founding texts of Christian theology, still printed, still taught, still cited in seminaries today. And yet, look for a Sunday sermon that develops this passage. Look for a catechism that explains it to children. You will find almost nothing. The confession has existed for 1,600 years. The silence about this confession, however, is doing very well. This is why Cain's wife is not just a curious detail lost in an obscure chapter of Genesis. She is living proof, well, textual proof, of a fact that orthodoxy has preferred to keep in the blind spot of public reading. At the origin of the biblical story of humanity, there was no other possibility than union between the same bloodline. Cain married a woman who, according to the internal logic of the text, could only have been one of his close relatives, a sister, according to the most straightforward reading. But then, why is her name missing precisely where the question becomes awkward? Yet, this silence did not go unanswered. Not from the theologians who officially commented on the received text. They mostly accepted the verse as it was, never emphasizing the implication that Augustine, for his part, had the rare courage to express. The answer came from elsewhere, from parallel traditions, outside the canon accepted by Rome and Byzantium, which never agreed to leave this woman without an identity. Texts you never read in church have, each in their own way, tried to fill the gap. One of them gives her a name. Another makes her the twin of one of the two brothers. A third goes even further. It questions the very identity of Cain's father himself, opening a breach that the church deemed so dangerous that it sent its inquisitors to close it, centuries later, even in the Languedoc region. 4 traditions, 4 names. One woman, erased from the central text and found again, piece by piece, in the margins that orthodoxy has never fully managed to silence. The first of these names awaits you in a text that the Latin Church excluded from its Bible, but that another church, older than you might think, has preserved as sacred scripture to this day. A name that the Western canon erased, but that another canon, just as ancient, kept without ever forgetting. The Book of Jubilees. A Jewish text written about 2 centuries before our era, which retells Genesis verse by verse and fills in, wherever the Masoretic text falls silent, every gap in the story. Chapter 4. And there, without detour, without exegetical caution, Cain's wife is given a name, Awan, daughter of Adam and Eve. So, remember this word. It carries the full weight of the case. His sister. I wanted to verify this detail for myself before presenting it to you as an established fact. Open with me the critical edition of this text, the one translated from Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, the only language in which this book has survived in its entirety. Notice the precision of the passage. It doesn't just name Awan, it specifies the order of her birth, her place among Adam's sons, the date of her marriage, referenced according to a dating system unique to the text. This level of detail surprised me. I expected a brief mention, a narrative patch hastily placed over a gap in the story. Instead, I found a complete, coherent genealogy, designed as a system, not as a last-minute improvisation, not a late literary sketch, a religious text, transmitted, copied, recopied, regarded as sacred by an entire community for over 2,000 years. Awan exists. She has a name, a father, a mother, a precise place in the genealogy. She is the sister of the man she marries, and this name does not come alone. Rabbinic tradition, in a major commentary compiled several centuries later, Genesis Rabbah, section 22, puts forward a hypothesis that suddenly makes the entire narrative mechanism coherent. Eve gave birth to twins at every delivery. A twin sister with Cain, another with Abel. Two texts, two traditions, two different origins. Hellenistic Jewish for one, Babylonian Rabbinic for the other. And yet the same silent conclusion. The nameless woman of chapter 4 has always had an identity. It was simply taken from her somewhere along the way, on the path that leads from the Hebrew text to your Bible. Imagine for a moment the academy where this commentary took shape. A study hall in the land of Babylonia, generations after the destruction of the temple, where masters orally passed down, verse by verse, what the previous generation had entrusted to them. A disciple asked the troubling question, if Cain and Abel each had only one parent in common with any other woman in the world, how can the continuation of the human race be explained without a logical break? The master does not avoid the question. He answers with a simple, almost domestic image. Each birth produced a pair, a brother and a sister, connected from the womb. The lesson is recorded, copied on the parchment by scribes who never set foot outside their study circle, then passed down for centuries before being fixed in writing. What I find striking is that this rabbinic answer never needed the support of the Ethiopian text to exist. The two traditions arose independently, without consulting each other, and yet they converge on the same woman. Let's review what we already know, because the case is starting to weigh heavily. The canonical text keeps the name of this woman silent. Augustine, for his part, openly admits that the first marriages were between brothers and sisters. And now, two independent Jewish traditions, separated by centuries and continents of scholarship, agree on a precise identity: Awan, sister of Cain. But no one, within the orthodoxy that fixed your Bible, can explain why this name, known, documented, cited in religious texts still in use today in an entire church, never crossed the threshold of the canon you received. Because here is what few viewers know, and what I am showing you now. This text has not disappeared. It was not lost in a fire nor destroyed by time. The Book of Jubilees is, even today, sacred scripture, read, preached, and taught in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, an ancient Christian church, uninterrupted since antiquity, with millions of faithful. For them, Awan is not a marginal theory. She is a biblical fact, as established as the name Abraham. Think about what this means in concrete terms. On the high plateaus of Ethiopia, in a mountain monastery where the air grows thin and manuscripts lie rolled up in goat leather, a monk, copying texts, bent over for hours under candlelight, traces letter by letter the name Awan, in a language that almost no one outside this circle reads fluently anymore. He doesn't ask the question that haunts Western theologians, because for him, it has never arisen. The text he copies has always been authoritative, passed down from monastery to monastery, protected from fires, wars, and droughts by generations of guardians who never knew that elsewhere, on another continent, this very same woman did not exist. Two Bibles, two official truths about the same woman. In one, she doesn't exist. In the other, she has a name, a father, a place in the family tree. And these two Bibles coexist today on the same African continent, in churches that both recognize themselves as Christian. So why did Rome and Byzantium, when fixing their canon, leave this text aside, precisely the one that fills the most embarrassing gap in Genesis? Before going any further, a word to you who are following this story with me. If this piece surprised you, a name preserved in an entire Bible but absent from yours, a thumbs up helps this investigation reach other eyes capable of verifying what I'm showing you. One question remains that I couldn't resolve while preparing this report, and I'll say it plainly. I don't know for certain why a Western council, at a specific moment in its history, chose to exclude a text that offered exactly the answer everyone was looking for. What is certain, however, is the human cost of this silence, and this is where the story stops being just about manuscripts. Think about what it means to exist without a name in the founding text of your own civilization. A woman marries the man who killed her other brother, because if the twin hypothesis holds, Abel was not only Owan's brother-in-law, he might also have been, through this twin bond, a part of her own flesh, lost on the same day as hers. She then gives birth to the first child born outside the garden, outside the original grace, in a land of exile that even her own husband does not recognize. She passes her bloodline to all the descendants that follow, and the text that tells this story refuses, 4,000 years later, to even write her first name. This is not a literary oversight. It is the erasure of a founding mother, cataloged only by function, the wife of, never as a person. How many women throughout history have suffered this same fate, essential to the continuation of the story, absent from its text? Owan has had a name for 2,000 years. It just took looking off the beaten path that was shown to you. And this detour doesn't stop at Ethiopia. There is a second tradition, even older than the Book of Jubilees, that does not merely name Cain's sister. It challenges the very identity of Adam's father. And what this text claims about the origin of this woman is so disturbing that entire inquisitions were mobilized, centuries later, to eradicate it from Europe. But in that text, the one I'm about to open with you, the name isn't even the strangest detail. The name is not the strangest detail. What comes next changes the very nature of the investigation, and I didn't see it coming. Until now, everything held together. A silent verse, a bishop who admits the union between brother and sister, an Ethiopian text that names the sister, a rabbinic tradition that speaks of twins, one single question, where does she come from? And an answer that seemed to gently converge in one direction. Then I opened a later text, and the question itself turned over in my hands. Pirkei to Rabbi Eliezer, a midrashic compilation written down between the 8th and 9th centuries AD, but gathering much older oral traditions, passed from master to disciple for generations before being committed to writing. Chapter 21. And here, the text no longer discusses Cain's wife. It attacks Cain himself. According to this chapter, Cain is not Adam's son. Note that sentence, because it deserves to be repeated slowly. The text claims that Cain was born from the union of the serpent and Eve, not Adam. An entirely different paternity. An origin that takes Cain's lineage out of the strictly human circle, as Genesis tells it in chapter 2. I'll be honest with you. While preparing this file, I expected to find variations on the sister's name, maybe a translation dispute, a disagreement among scholars over a syllable. I did not expect to find a religious text, still studied today in certain Jewish study circles, that calls into question Cain's very father. And here's what this means for the question that has opened this file from the start. Where does Cain's wife come from? If Cain is the son of Eve alone and not of Adam, then the answer, sister by the same father, no longer suffices. The rabbinic reading of the twins assumed a single parental line, that of Adam and Eve together, a unique founding couple whose every birth produces a brother-sister pair. The text I have just opened breaks this clear pattern. It proposes another line, a lineage of Cain that does not descend entirely from the humanity created in the garden, but from a union outside this line, outside the species, outside the original blessing. The question, where does she come from, therefore, no longer has a single answer contested between two related traditions. It has two radically incompatible. Either a sister in the strict sense, born of the same human parents, or a union which, according to that tradition, places Cain and all his descendants outside even the circle that Adam founded. Two readings, one, Genesis, and a disagreement so deep that it no longer concerns a missing name, but the very nature of the first human family. How could such a central religious text contain, within itself, such a radical contradiction without ever being corrected or removed? I don't have a simple answer to that. What I can show you, however, is that this tradition about the serpent was not born in a vacuum. It has a history much older than its medieval transcription, and far more disturbing than this isolated chapter lets on. Let's go back nearly 7 centuries before the writing of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. A bishop of Lyon in Roman Gaul writes the most comprehensive treatise ever composed against what the nascent church considers its worst doctrinal deviations. Irenaeus, Against Heresies, Book 1, Chapter 31. And there the bishop describes, with horror he does not hide, a sect he calls the Cainites. Before we go any further, let me show you where my knowledge of this treatise comes from, because the source itself deserves to be verified. The text of Irenaeus has not come down to us in its original language, Greek. The original has almost entirely disappeared. What libraries preserve today is a Latin translation, made by anonymous copyists, along with some Syriac and Armenian fragments found separately, centuries later, in isolated monasteries. I wanted to compare these versions before quoting the passage about the Cainites. They agree, almost word for word, on this specific point, which, for a researcher, is the strongest sign that a passage has not been altered along the way. 3 separate manuscript traditions, 3 languages, 3 different places of preservation, and the same accusation leveled against the same sect. This does not prove that the Cainites were right. It does prove, however, that Irenaeus did not invent their existence to suit his argument. Men and women who, according to Irenaeus, worshipped Cain, not as the first murderer in human history, but as a bearer of knowledge, a superior, forbidden knowledge, passed down from an origin that the official Genesis narrative, according to them, sought to conceal. Think about what this implies. An entire group of believers in the very earliest centuries of Christianity built a complete theology around the idea that Cain was not simply a fallen son of Adam, but the keeper of knowledge that the God of the garden had deliberately wanted to keep out of reach. For these Cainites, the murder of Abel was not an additional fall after the one in the garden. It was, in their reversed reading of the story, almost an act of breaking away from an order they considered oppressive. Try to imagine the scene as Irenaeus must have experienced it. A bishop, in his home in Lyon, receives the testimony of a concerned believer, someone who may have encountered, perhaps within their own family, a follower of this forbidden interpretation. The bishop listens, takes notes on wax tablets, asks precise questions. What exactly do they say about Cain? What do they say about the serpent? What do they say about the Creator God himself? The believer hesitates. Repeating these words, even to denounce them, is to give them a weight that Irenaeus would prefer to suppress. But the bishop insists, because he knows that a heresy that is not named precisely is a heresy that cannot be fought. He records everything with the precision of a man who knows that his treatise will one day have to convince other bishops elsewhere that this danger is real. It is this transcription, made in the urgency of a living controversy and not in the calm of a study room, that has come down to us 1,800 years later. Irenaeus writes this treatise to combat this interpretation, to silence it, to protect what he considers the received truth. But the very fact that he had to devote an entire chapter to it proves one thing. This interpretation existed, with enough strength and followers to worry the bishopric of Lyon in the 2nd century. So let's ask the question directly. Is it a coincidence that 7 centuries later, a rabbinic tradition picks up, in its own way, the idea of a non-Adamic origin for Cain, that of the serpent? Two traditions, separated by centuries, by continents, by languages, and by entirely different theologies. One heretical Christian condemned in Lyon, the other Jewish preserved in a study text still consulted today, and yet both independently shift Cain's paternity outside the strictly human line. This is not a coincidence that I can explain with the documents I have before me. It is a convergence, and convergences in serious investigation are never dismissed without examination. What I do know, however, is this. If this tradition about Cain's origin has any foundation, then the question that opened this inquiry, who was Cain's wife, becomes almost secondary in the face of a far more dizzying question. Who or what Cain himself was. And there exists a document, older than all those I have just shown you, that seems to have anticipated exactly this vertigo. A document the Church judged so dangerous that it made it disappear for more than 1,500 years. An older document than all the others, I said at the end of the previous file. But before opening it, we first need to understand why so few documents of this kind have come down to us at all. Because here's what I ended up understanding by piecing these fragments together one by one. Irenaeus' testimony about the Cainites is not just one testimony among many. It is, to my knowledge, the only ancient patristic source that describes from the inside a radically reversed reading of Cain. The only Christian voice from the very earliest centuries to have recorded, even if only to fight against it, the existence of a tradition that portrayed Cain as something other than a simple, cursed murderer. Only one source, not two, not three, just one. And this source does not speak to us about the tradition itself from within. It speaks to us through the eyes of its most determined opponent. We know the Cainites only through the text of the man who wanted them wiped out. No original Cainite writings, no versions signed by a member of this sect have survived to reach you. Everything we know about them passes through the filter of the one who cataloged them as a heresy to be crushed. This should make you pause for a moment. A single window held by a single hand, and that hand belonged to the prosecution, never the defense. I wanted to check whether this absence was total, or if a fragment, even a tiny one, had escaped the purge. There is one case that comes close, and I prefer to show it to you rather than claim it without proof. In a sealed jar, buried near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, and found by peasants in the mid-20th century. Entire codices of Gnostic texts resurfaced after centuries underground. Among them, a work that bears Cain's very name in its title, and that follows, almost word for word, the thought structure that Irenaeus attributed to the Cainites. I consulted the translation of this codex before writing these lines, wondering if I would finally hear the voice of the sect itself, rather than that of its accuser. What I found there sent me back to my starting point, a fragmentary, damaged text, whose precise attribution to the Cainites described by Irenaeus remains debated by scholars themselves. The jar survived being buried under sand for more than 16 centuries, but it was not enough to restore an equal dialogue between prosecution and defense. The imbalance remains almost complete. So I wanted to understand how this filtering process worked over time. Not just for the Cainites. For all the parallel traditions we encountered in this investigation, Awan and the Book of Jubilees, the twins from Genesis Rabbah, the serpent from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. 4 independent traditions, 4 different origins, 4 different centuries, and all 4 offer an explanation to the same foundational question: who was Cain's wife, or what Cain himself was? And yet, none of these 4 traditions survive in the text that Rome handed down to you as received scripture. This is not a coincidence of transmission, it is a policy. Here is the piece that allowed me to understand the mechanism, and I have to say, it disturbed me more than I expected. Athanasius of Alexandria, one of the founding fathers of Christian orthodoxy, the very man who fixed, in an annual letter addressed to the churches of Egypt, the first known list that corresponds exactly to the New Testament canon you read today. This letter has a number, Festal Letter 39, written in the year 367. This letter itself almost disappeared, and its survival story deserves to be told. The original Greek text is lost. What allows us today to know its precise content comes, for the most part, from a fragmentary Coptic version and a Syriac manuscript preserved at the British Museum, which a 19th century curator, William Cureton, unearthed and deciphered among thousands of scrolls brought back from a monastery in the Nitrian desert. Cureton worked entire days in a cold reading room, piecing together brittle parchment fragments, not knowing at first what he held in his hands. Only by patiently assembling the pieces did he realize he was reconstructing the very letter that had sealed the fate of so many other ancient texts. The irony did not escape me when I discovered it. The only testimony we have left of this order of destruction survived by accident in an isolated monastery more than 1,400 years after it was written. And in this very letter, Athanasius does not merely establish the list of books to be retained. He orders, in terms that leave no room for ambiguity, the destruction of the writings that are not included, not their sidelining, not their relegation to a secondary library, their destruction. And among the texts targeted by this purge, we find precisely the type of parallel traditions we have been following since the beginning of this investigation. Those that offered alternative versions of the origins of Cain and his wife, outside the single narrative that orthodoxy now wanted to transmit as the only legitimate version. Take a moment to grasp the significance of this moment. A man in a city in Egypt writes an annual letter intended to circulate among the monasteries and parishes under his jurisdiction. And this letter alone becomes the founding act of a silence that then spans 1,700 years of religious history. This is where the case stops being just about ancient texts, because this kind of purge has never been just a matter of paper. Think about what this means concretely. Somewhere in a monastery in the Egyptian desert, the year this letter is read aloud for the first time before a community of monks, an elderly scribe who has spent his entire life copying manuscripts receives the order to remove from his scriptorium the scrolls he himself copied, sometimes with his own hand, decades earlier. He knows these texts by heart. He traced every letter, watched over every page by the light of an oil lamp. Now he is asked to deliver them to the fire, or to let the parchment disintegrate without ever copying it again, which in a generation amounts to the same result. He obeys, because disobeying a festal letter from a patriarch of Alexandria is not an option for a monk of his rank. But something about this act feels less like a theological decision and more like the forced erasure of an entire memory, his own and that of all those who will come after him and never know these pages ever existed. How many voices throughout history have been silenced not by debate, but by the simple physical disappearance of the medium that carried them? This is not a question unique to 4th century Egypt. It is a question every generation has had to face in its own way, every time a power decided alone what deserved to survive. And there it is, finally, the answer to the question I've been carrying since the beginning of this investigation. Why the Book of Jubilees, which names Awan, never made it through the door of the Western canon. It's not that it was considered unreliable, nor that it simply disappeared by accident in transmission. It was excluded by the same kind of institutional decision recorded in black and white in Athanasius's letter. A decision that establishes a single, authorized version and actively organizes the erasure of everything that doesn't conform to it. The Ethiopian canon survived because it was, geographically and politically, out of reach of that specific authority. Elsewhere, the purge worked exactly as planned. 4 traditions converge on the same woman, the same question, the same gap in the foundational narrative. Only one hand decided which of these 4 versions would reach you. But this letter of Athanasius is not an isolated case. There is a later council, whose minutes themselves were long thought lost, where this very question, what to do about Cain's troubling origins, was debated in terms that this time had nothing theological about them. A tribunal, I said, but it wasn't a council of theologians calmly debating in a library. It was an interrogation room in Languedoc, where a bishop recorded, word for word, the beliefs of men and women he was about to send to the stake. Jacques Fournier, Bishop of Pamiers in the Pyrenees between the years 1318 and 1325. A methodical man, almost obsessive in the way he recorded every confession, to the point that he would later become Pope under the name Benedict XII, and his Inquisition registers, preserved intact all the way to you, are today one of the most precious sources history has to understand what the Cathar heretics of Languedoc really believed. Open these registers with me. These are not summaries written afterward by accusers eager to conclude. These are transcripts of interrogations, sometimes conducted over several sessions, where the bishop notes the exact words spoken by the accused, their hesitations, their contradictions, their own phrasing. Let me show you what one of these sessions actually looks like, as recorded in the register. A woman from the village of Montaillou is brought before the bishop. She has already been interrogated once before, months earlier, and she knows that every word she now utters can be held against her until her death. "Do you believe," the notary who is recording for Fournier asks her, "that this visible world was created by the good God?" "I was taught," she replies, "that this world is not the work of good." "Who taught you that?" She hesitates. Naming a perfect Cathar would condemn him. Staying silent would only prolong her own interrogation until she finally gave in. The record simply notes at this point that she asks to think before answering, a dry, administrative phrase behind which one can sense the full weight of a life hanging in the balance over a handful of words. This scene, reconstructed from the very style of the minutes Fournier left behind, gives an idea of what it meant, concretely, to transmit a forbidden cosmogony in 14th century Languedoc. Every statement of belief potentially paid for with the highest price imaginable. And in these pages, a precise, coherent cosmogony returns, one that the Cathars held to be true at the risk of their lives. For them, the visible world, the matter, the flesh, everything that can be touched and seen, was not the work of the good God. It was the work of a rival principle, a creator of evil responsible for everything that imprisons the soul in a perishable body. And in this dualistic cosmogony, the lineage of Cain held a specific place. It belonged entirely to this material and fallen world, to this visible side of creation that the perfect Cathars sought, through a life of extreme asceticism, to escape until their last breath. Note what this means for our case. The question of Cain's wife among the Cathars was not limited to a problem of biblical genealogy. It was part of an entire theology of good and evil, where the origin of this lineage became living proof that material creation itself bore, since the first murder, the mark of a principle hostile to the soul. And this theology, as vast and coherent as it was almost entirely annihilated, not by a lost debate, but by an army. The Albigensian Crusade, launched against Languedoc between 1209 and 1229, did not just conquer castles, it destroyed entire libraries, scattered communities that had orally transmitted their cosmogony for generations, and left to the inquisitors, a few decades later, the task of reconstructing this system of thought from the confessions forcibly extracted from hunted survivors. Imagine the last stronghold that stood against this crusade, perched on a rocky outcrop in the Pyrenees. For months, the besieged lived there, huddled behind stone ramparts, while siege engines relentlessly struck below. When the fortress finally fell, the perfects who refused to recant descended themselves to the pyre set at the foot of the rock, without a word of denial. With them also disappeared the manuscripts they guarded, the oral formulas they had never had time to fully write down. An entire body of knowledge passed from perfect to believer for generations, reduced to ashes in a single winter night. What Jacques Fournier put down on parchment decades later is therefore not the Cathar cosmogony in its fullness. It is what remained after a century of siege, of pyres, and forced silence. A text reconstructed from the ruins of its own destruction. This, I believe, is the best possible definition of this entire dossier. Now, here is a moment when I had to stop while preparing this research, because something gripped me that I had not anticipated at the start. Think back for a moment to everything we have encountered since the beginning of this investigation. A Jewish compiler in Palestine or Alexandria, 2 centuries before our era, who refuses to leave a gap in his own sacred text and invents the name Awan. Rabbis, centuries later, in Babylonia, who build the hypothesis of twins to give this woman a coherent place in the narrative. Cathar perfects, in 13th century Languedoc, who risk the stake to orally transmit an entire cosmogony built, in part, around this same lineage. 3 traditions, 3 continents of thought, 3 periods separated by centuries, and each time faced with a central text that chooses silence. Someone, somewhere, refuses to accept that silence as final. This refusal crosses persecutions, pyres, the destruction of libraries, and it resurfaces tirelessly in a new form. There is something in this human stubbornness to name what authority wants to silence that commands respect far beyond the purely theological question. These are voices that continued to speak while everything around them had been designed to silence them forever. And this refusal to remain silent does not stop at the borders of the Judeo-Christian world. There is a fourth tradition, independent of the previous three, born in a completely different religious world, yet converging toward the same act. Al-Tabari, one of the greatest historians and exegetes of medieval Islam, wrote in the 10th century a monumental work, The History of the Prophets and Kings, which retells the entire biblical narrative in the light of Islamic traditions. And there, without hesitation, without detour, the sister destined for Cain also receives a name, Aklima. A complete Islamic tradition unfolds around this name. Each son of Adam was born with a twin sister, and the law required that a brother marry the twin sister of the other. So Cain was supposed to marry Abel's twin sister, not his own. According to this tradition, it was precisely this disagreement that triggered the fatal jealousy between the two brothers, Cain refusing the arrangement and coveting Aklima, his own twin, who was said to be more beautiful than the one promised to his brother. 4 traditions: Hellenistic Jewish, Babylonian Rabbinic, Cathar dualist, medieval Islamic. 4 religious worlds that, separately, without ever consulting one another, refused the same thing: to let this woman disappear into the anonymity of a single verse. Only one tradition kept silent until the very end. It is the one Rome passed down to you. Only one tradition kept silent until the very end. It is the one Rome passed down to you. Let's go over, one last time, what this silence tried to cover up. 4 names. 4 faces proposed for the same woman by 4 worlds that never consulted each other. Awan, in the Book of Jubilees, daughter of Adam and Eve, sister of Cain, according to the most direct reading any Jewish text has ever offered on this biblical gap. An anonymous twin sister in Genesis Rabbah, born the same day as Cain, according to the Babylonian masters, so that the logic of human population would hold together. A daughter of the serpent, according to Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, an origin that takes Cain himself out of the strictly human circle and turns the whole question of his origin upside down. And Aklima, finally, in Al-Tabari's history, named, documented, integrated into a complete system of twins and cross marriages that even explains the fatal jealousy between the 2 brothers. 4 traditions, 4 distinct answers. And not one agrees completely with the others on the exact name, nor on the precise origin of this woman. I ended up printing the 4 passages one by one and laying them side by side on my desk one evening to see what the eye alone could make of them without the help of any scholarly commentary. 4 sheets, 4 different original languages: Ge'ez, the Aramaic of rabbinic commentaries, late Hebrew, and Al-Tabari's Arabic. None of them cite the other 3. None could, historically, have had full knowledge of the others at the time of their writing. And yet, arranged like this under the same lamp, they outline the same hollow silhouette: a woman whom the central text refuses to name and whom each civilization, in turn, has chosen not to let disappear entirely. I expected, in conducting this comparison, to find echoes of translation, probable borrowings from one tradition to another. Instead, I found 4 independent inventions converging toward the same human need: to refuse that a founding mother remain a mere pronoun. That, I believe, is the most honest truth I can offer you at the end of this investigation. There is no definitive consensus on who Cain's wife was. This is not a failure of research. It is the very nature of the void that the canonical text left behind. A void wide enough for 4 civilizations to project into it, each according to its own religious logic, a coherent yet distinct answer from all the others. So let us finally answer, as precisely as the sources allow, the question that opened this inquiry. Where does she come from? The honest answer is not a single name. It is this. She comes from the same gap that Genesis has left wide open from the start, and each tradition that has tried to fill it says as much about itself as it does about this faceless woman. The Masoretic text itself never chose to answer. It chose to remain silent, and that choice alone is already a form of answer. Because this silence is not a neutral void. A neutral void would not have required a festal letter from Athanasius in the year 367 ordering the destruction of writings that proposed another version. A neutral void would not have required an army sent against Languedoc to erase an entire cosmogony built, in part, on that very lineage. The silence of Genesis is a trace, the trace of an editorial choice whose concrete effects we can now date, from the council that fixed a list of books to the canon definitively closed, which reaches you today as if it had always been this way, as if no other version had ever existed. And that is why Augustine of Hippo, in the 5th century, was able to write black on white that the first marriages were necessarily between brothers and sisters, without this admission ever becoming a sermon, a catechism, or an explanation offered to the faithful from a pulpit. It's not that the sentence was too technical to be preached. It's that the same mechanism that excluded Awan, that silenced the Cainites, that burned the Cathar libraries, also taught Latin orthodoxy never to publicly develop what its own founding fathers had admitted in private, in their own treatises. An admission kept, an explanation never given. The same gesture repeated for 1,600 years. A few years ago, in a reading room of a large library, I held in my hands an old edition of The City of God, open precisely to the chapter where Augustine makes this admission. The librarian, handing me the dark leather-bound volume, said something I have never forgotten. That this book was consulted every year by dozens of theology students, and that almost none of them ever stopped on this particular chapter. He knew the text by heart from handling it so often, but he had never heard a professor develop it in class. This simple exchange, spoken quietly between 2 bookshelves, confirmed what documents alone could not prove. The silence is not an accident of reading. It is a habit passed down silently, from generation to generation, without any written instruction needing to be repeated. So it's not just an unnamed woman that this file has followed. It's the very mechanism by which a central religious text chooses, in every generation, what it transmits and what it erases. And this mechanism, once you learn to recognize it, never stops at a single verse. If this file seemed worth digging into further, say so in the comments. I read every lead you suggest, and some of them have already changed the direction of a future investigation. And if you want me to take up this same verification work on other biblical silences, a thumbs up tells me to keep going in this direction. Because 4 traditions ended up naming a woman whom Rome preferred to silence. And she is not the only female figure that the canon has erased in this way. The file remains open. The silence, however, had an author.